Welcome back, everyone. You may have noticed that we have begun the recording. It will not record your participation, only the presentation that Andy and I are doing. But in that vein, we would like to invite you to share in the chat, which we will read from some of the things you heard in your breakout room in response to the query, what would it mean for you to be welcomed home from the wilderness? And what would it mean to have a friend in the wilderness? So please share some of the things you heard in the chat.
Being rooted, grounded, and embraced.
Noticing and calling out gifts.
Mm. Listening deeply.
Sharing the ministry.
Noticing the divergence between the direction of the meeting and the call of ministers within it. Mm.
Space to be honest and vulnerable.
Finding support when in the brambles.
I'm reading these and it's really like warming my heart. Engaging with a wider Quaker community and building trust with that group.
Being recognized and helped to understand gifts I didn't yet know of. Finding myself speaking as from a different country. Mm. With some stepping forward to offer support.
There is as much potential for freedom and burden in both the wilderness and home.
Mm. Uh. Being given freedom to listen to the inner light to discover your ministry.
Mm. Thank you, friends. The importance of a meeting for support, the need for a place to be recognized when without a meeting, chaplaincy as a place to be Quaker where called.
Mm-hmm.
I hear this longing in these reflections to be a part of a family, to be a part of something that is greater than our own desires or designs. Um, and I also hear this longing for liberation, this creative liberation, the ability to be released into the labor that we are most called to. Andy, do you mind starting the presentation? So when Andy and I were thinking about what kind of presentation we wanted to do this evening, we reflected on the presentation we did last month, which was on accountability and the mutual accountability between an individual called to ministry and a community that is called to ministry, and the relationship between the community and the individual. And we talked in that about why it's important to kind of stay with a deeply problematic public minister or a deeply problematic home community. And the reason we gave for that is that it is intrinsically a part of Quaker theology to be in relationship, listening for where the divine is leading us. And that is not easy. If we've ever had any relationships in our lives, we know that to be the case. I think the reflection on how both the home and the wilderness can be problematic under the right circumstances really speaks to that. And additionally, we talked about attachment theory and about how our, our greatest desire as people and communities is to be secure in our relationships. And that is not something we can choose to do on our own. It is only something we do in relationship with other people. We create the environment for healthy relationships by being in relationship and being mindful of the environment that we are creating for one another. Unfortunately, as we talked about in that presentation, our home meetings are very often not places of healthy and secure attachment, and not places that really live up to the aspiration of Quaker theology that we are in relationship together, listening to the prophetic call of the divine. And this is true. Andy talked about program traditions, and this is true there. And I can attest that this is very much the case in the unprogrammed traditions, which is where I am from. So in those patterns we talked about in the previous session, elders play a role in building a healthy environment that we want or an unhealthy environment that we don't want. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about what healthy eldership might look like and how we have personally experienced it, and also what unhealthy eldership looks like and how we have experienced that. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so as Wendy mentioned, I'm speaking more from the programmed tradition of elders and eldering. And I thought it would be helpful to start off by just recognizing that some of the associations that we have with the word elder and eldering, and how sometimes that can be it can be an opportunity, but it can also be an obstacle. And I was talking with somebody in this a couple days ago who, like me, came from an evangelical Friends background and now is more in the FUM world. And she said when she hears eldering, she thinks of being in trouble and like almost like being called to the principal's office. And I think some of us maybe have that association. I think of it's kind of random, but a memory I have of eldering is at my church. This is a number of several years ago, and somebody stood up during open worship and wanted to talk about the church's budget and said that we were stealing from Peter to pay Paul, and he didn't approve of that. I guess he thought because there were biblical references that it was appropriate for that context. But after worship was over, he turned around to me and he said, "I think I'm in trouble." and and at that point, a couple elders came over and were, kind of like, we, these are, we can talk about the budget, but not during open worship or waiting worship. So that's kind of sometimes our association with eldering. Um, but also an obstacle can be just the mixed feelings that we have with leadership in general among Quakers. Um, I I know this is a gross oversimplification, so I'm going to exaggerate a point in order to make it. But sometimes I think evangelical friends know they want leaders. FGC folks know they don't want leaders. And FUM, it's like we don't know whether we do or don't. It's a very conflicted feeling. We both want them and don't want them. And I don't think that's just true among Friends United meeting. There's a lot of us as Quakers, we both long for that and also resist it at the same time. And we're not quite sure how to reflect the testimony of equality with having leaders. And so we have this uneasy thing about it. Um, and besides the mixed feelings among within Quakerism, there's also just in our culture in North America, um, where we really value autonomy and individualism, and so we kind of reluctant to the idea of elders. And I think that uh, for me came to the forefront when I was living in the Northwest and developed a relationship with. He was actually one of my professors, and he was um, a Native American Christian, but they had this monthly gathering that was a sweat lodge and then a potluck afterwards. And I think it was just like spending time with them, both through the ceremony and just kind of the general like culture that really showed um, the respect they had for elders. It was like both in the ceremony of the sweat lodge and then when we go to the potluck, it was always the elders that would go first. And then there was like this order to it. Then the last people were the kind of younger men. And I realized that's almost like completely flipped uh, our so-called normal cultural European values. And also we would bring a gift for the ceremonial elder, um, like coffee or tobacco or something like that. So just these kind of cultural things can result in these mixed feelings. And I think right now there's a lot of this very strong push and pull of both resistance and longing for elders within and outside of Quakerism or religious communities. And I thought of this image of the pointing finger, so we don't want the elder that's pointing the finger to critique and criticize. We don't necessarily need more judgment and shame, right? We've got that. Um, but we do long for the pointing finger that helps us either point out the wisdom we have within us or to help us find our way and say, this is the way, walk in it, this way of wisdom. And so I just thought it would be helpful to kind of name that um, as we begin. Okay, so what are the roles of elders within evangelical friends. So I just use as an example Northwest Yearly Meeting that includes churches and meetings within Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, maybe Alaska as well. But this is what they list in their faith and practice, which, by the way, I draw this from a document, kind of an elder's handbook that Wendy, if you wouldn't mind sending the link for that, that Colin Saxton, if you know him, helped put this together and provides a thorough and helpful kind of explanation of elders in more the evangelical programmed friends meetings. So the roles are affirm and uphold faith and practice, determine policies for worship and fellowship, recommend the calling of pastors, support pastoral ministry through cooperation and counsel, oversee programs of evangelism, discipleship, and community outreach, foster spiritual gifts and nurture ministry and missionary service, encourage recording, counsel members in regard to their spiritual maturity, sometimes providing loving discipline, review, prepare, and recommend applicants for membership, encourage prayer and Bible study privately and in groups, foster a concern for ministry concerns and find volunteers, nominate members of the nominating committee, and keep in touch with non-resident members. So you'll see just, the general themes of nurturing spiritual growth in the meeting, overseeing or promoting the spiritual vitality of the meeting, and overseeing the call process for pastors and the membership process as well. And something that did seem to be unique that I didn't see with some other faith and practices that or roles of elders is the affirming and upholding faith and practice, which I found interesting, a little bit different. And I'm not sure if I know that there were some, there was a pretty significant split in Northwest Yearly Meeting, and there was a lot of division about the role of faith and practice. So I'm not sure when that got put in there or if that kind of developed in a later version. But and then this is West Hills Friends. It was previously part of Northwest Yearly Meeting and is now affiliated with Sierra Cascades Yearly Meeting, which is also in the Northwest. They're located in Portland, and we talked about that kind of ecological imagery, and I think I don't know if they used that word ecosystem, but it seemed like they were presenting the idea that there's kind of this ecosystem of leadership in the meeting, that there's kind of the business meeting and all the members, and there's the elders, and there's the released ministers or pastors, and they all have different roles in working together. And so you'll see the list there of their roles, which are similar, supporting the spiritual growth of the meeting and membership, developing those relationships, overseeing recording, and working with the pastors. There's a picture of the meeting house. It's a lovely space there. And then moving to Friends United Meeting, using Wilmington Yearly Meeting as an example. There are the guidance is more based on queries than on lists. And I've only included 3 of the 6 here. It was fairly extensive, but you can see there it's questioning about setting an example of faithfulness and worship. Are you aware of the necessity of harmonious relationships with your fellow members as a basis for the most effective service? Developing the special talents and abilities, seeking divine guidance. So again, similar spiritual nurture, spiritual vitality. And then since programmed meetings are more drawing a lot from scripture, oftentimes they'll reference these two passages that I'm just going to put up here and mention. This one from 1 Peter 5, you see like early on, these early Christian communities are wrestling with their own um, issues of leadership, tending to be more egalitarian, but also having this perennial issues about authority. But here we have the elders being referenced, being called to shepherd God's flock under your care, watching over them. And you'll see, first of all, pointing out the shepherd imagery, of course, was something that Jesus used in his teachings. And also, it's unlikely that Peter himself wrote this, but coming from that tradition of Peter, that shepherd imagery was surely close to his heart, because I don't, if you're familiar with the story, after the resurrection, Jesus, Peter denied knowing Jesus, and then after the resurrection, Jesus goes and seems like heals the three denials by giving him the chance to affirm his commitment to Christ 3 times. And there's this restoration that takes place, and he says, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Then feed my sheep." And so there's this ongoing sense of calling to be shepherds, and avoiding the traps of leaders who are hungry for power or dishonest gain. And also saying, because not because you must, but because you are willing. I think it's always a good thing to serve based on a willingness and consent and calling versus coercion. Then another one that is often referenced is 1 Timothy 3, that talks about overseers. Actually, the New Revised Standard Version calls them bishops, which is interesting. But same kind of list here of what a healthy and effective elder would be like. And the assumption here is that we're talking about a man, but there's plenty of evidence that early on women were involved in most, if not all, of the roles of early Christian communities. But again, the avoiding violence, avoiding greed, and this concern for integrity, that their home life is reflects the kind of leadership they would offer in the church as well. So this is kind of my, if I was an apostle, Wendy was joking earlier, the apostle Andy, this would be my list of what makes for a good elder. It's not canonical. It's not considered part of scripture at this point yet. But in my life, the elders that have been most meaningful in my life have had these characteristics: a non-anxious presence, a prayerful presence, grounding. They notice things and share what they notice. There's a nurturer, but also not only nurturing, but also being an advocate and truth teller when that time is calls for it. Discerning, cares for both individuals and the members, so there's an eye on the meeting direction as a whole. Kind of keepers of the vision. And then this term appreciative eldering, that I'm borrowing from Pablo Stanfield, who is a friend in Washington State, and I'm a big fan of appreciative inquiry. So I think he's drawing from that world of where's their life, where's their good energy moving in the meeting, and elders have an eye on that and encouraging that.
Thank you, Andy. I was taking notes while you were talking. Um, so, the photograph here is of Joan Liversidge, around the time that I met her. Um, she's going to be 80 this month. I'm planning on going to her birthday party. Um, and I met Joan 11 years ago, the same day I met Eric Hansen, who I'm now married to, who is here this evening in another state. I didn't like Eric the day that I met him, but I very much like Joan. Um, and Joan and Eric had been co-facilitating a workshop, and Joan came up to me afterwards and was so curious about, who I was and what I was up to in the yearly meeting. And this is Baltimore yearly meeting. And at the time, I was very agitated and carrying in a very undisciplined way a concern about interpersonal violence in the yearly meeting. And Joan listened to me appreciatively, tenderly. She noticed, she nurtured throughout that conversation. And at the end of it, she said, "You know what you are? You're a public minister." And I said, what is that?" Um, and she explained. And Joan is not my only elder at this point. But she was my first elder, and the elder for my ministry. And if I were to ask, you know, does she love me? I know she does. Like, Andy was talking about Peter. She sends me emails that are sometimes vast to-do lists, and they end with, "I love you." Um, And, the way that Joan has held this ministry and held me as a person, at our last, she's also the clerk of my support committee at meeting. Um, and after everyone else had gone, she asked me about, what it was like for my son to be away at college. And I said, "I'm really grieving this. It's not that I didn't want him to grow up, but, gosh, this is hard." And she talks to me about that me as a person matters to her. And so I really hold Joan up as someone who is always learning how to be a better elder to those that are under her care. And she has really shown me what being an elder is. Um, in the liberal tradition of which I am part, I can't really show you any lists about, what an elder is. It's not as clear. I mean, our faith and practices do tend to mention being an elder. They might say, eldership is not restricted to people of a certain age, or they might, say, please don't be an obnoxious elder. The book on eldering that I talked about earlier talks about drive-by eldering, which is sort of the reputation elders have in the liberal community. They come, they tell you what you're doing wrong, and then they move on with their day. Um, but, an elder in our tradition can be Joan. And I know this experientially, as we say. I have had such an elder. And as I get older, it is true, eldership is not restricted to age, but you do gain wisdom, hopefully, as you get older. Um, as I get older, and I think hopefully become more mature, spiritually mature, and I am increasingly called on to serve as an elder for events, for traveling ministers, for workshops. It's Joan. And I can think of other people that have really held me, that I call on. Um, in my heart to remind myself what it is to be present to the minister that I'm being asked to hold in that moment. So I did a big research project as part of my doctoral work in which I interviewed many public ministers, mostly in the liberal tradition, again, since that's who I am. Um, and I was really struck by one of the people I interviewed who felt like their ministry was being an elder. And this person is in their 30s, so again, a relatively young person. But they really don't see their role as being an activist themselves, but as being a support to people who are trying to change Quaker community, specifically activists inside of the community. Um, and it was the first time it had really occurred to me that eldership is itself a ministry. Um, it is itself representative of a series of spiritual gifts. Like Andy was mentioning, I think there's a lot of crossover there between his list from the program tradition and what I would put on a list if I felt so inclined. Um, and then Johann Mauer is actually another elder of mine. Though he is in Sierra Cascades yearly meeting, he and his wife Judy both really serve as nurturers in my life. And they have actively been creating a nurture of ministry committee inside of Sierra Cascades. And their focus is primarily on listening. Um, And that is something, if you take nothing else from this presentation, I would really like you to think about what kind of listener you are, what kind of elder you are in the lives of the ministries around you and your ministry, and also what kind of listening you might be prepared to ask for inside of your community in your other role as a public minister. Next slide, please. So, we're going to go back and forth in this presentation between the healthy eldering and the unhealthy eldering, because the unhealthy eldering is just so big. It's it's so present inside both the programmed and unprogrammed traditions. So sometimes we think we are wise. We think that, experience is telling us, how to direct the lives around us. Um, and so elders, people who believe they have found wisdom inside of themselves, actually suppress prophetic voices. And it's because they are really drawn to maintaining stability. Adria, who's here this evening, who has also served as an elder to me, despite being probably at least 10 years younger than I am, and also serves on my support committee, has been a wonderful elder to me. Thank you, Adria. And she talks a lot. So a lot of her ministry is around spiritual gifts. And she talks about how there is a spiritual gift, this desire to shepherd that Andy was talking about, that can go wrong. It can have a dark side. And it looks like being, wanting to be, being most comfortable in an echo chamber where everything stays the same and we avoid discomfort. And that's how we love other people. But many of us don't feel loved when we are trapped in this echo chamber where our culture cannot change, our theology cannot develop, our own wisdom cannot develop. We cannot engage in the creativity that Quakerism is calling out of us when we feel a call from the divine inside of us. And Christy Randazzo, another wonderful elder in my life who is younger than I am, um, is a theologian living in New Jersey, and this is a picture of Christie's chest and their beard, and they are showing that their pronouns are they them, and this represents disruption in a lot of Quaker communities. Being queer continues to be a disruption in liberal Quaker communities. Um, and Christy says that like this is okay. Like disruption is not just okay, it is what Quakers are called to. That Quakerism is fundamentally about breaking that status quo. So when we are asking for eldering or we are considering, how to be an elder in someone's life, um, like resisting the urge to shepherd on that dark side and maintain stability at all cost, um, is, what we are fundamentally called to as Quakers, not just public ministers, not just prophetic voices, apart from the rest of Quakerism. It is actually a way of calling us into greater faithfulness with our community. And so it's deeply ironic that so many of us find ourselves isolated in that dark wilderness that we talked about at the beginning. Next slide, please. So I just want to draw your attention to something another elder of mine, Lucy Duncan, had to say at the first event in this series. It was called Strong and Courageous, and I think 15 public ministers talked as part of a panel about their experiences in public ministry amongst friends. And that is also on YouTube. And I think I sent you a link to that. If not, get in touch and I will send you the recording of that. It was amazing. But during that, Lucy was talking about her experience of being bullied.
Mm.
And, how ironic it is that very often in our communities, our elders in their sort of misguided attempt to maintain the status quo, do not interrupt people who are bullies, but they do interrupt people with a prophetic voice.
Mhm.
And I have often wondered, like, how do they know to do that? And if they know to do that, is there some wisdom we can glean from that about knowing the difference between someone who says they're a prophet, either explicitly or implicitly, but is actually a bully who is maintaining the status quo by force, and the status quo is white people and straight people and men are at the top, and other people are subordinate to them. How do we know the difference between that and react to that as elders in a disciplinary role, in a shepherding role that is in the light, versus the prophet who might be a little emotionally disorganized at first, like Joan found me 11 years ago. I would just kind of babble about interpersonal violence. But she took me and helped to form me and helped me to find other elders. How do we do that at the same time that we use our social power and our wisdom to interfere with bullying behavior inside of our meetings? Next slide, please.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you've picked up by now that the tensions between elders and ministers is cross stream, right? Cross Quaker streams at times, and um, so there's these tensions that are often present in programmed meetings between the elders and the ministers, in this case the pastors. Tradition and innovation, breathe and push, which that I am going back to last week when I talked about a woman named Valerie Coar, and she talked about the metaphor of birthing and social change as a birthing process that requires midwives who can say, now's the time to breathe and now's the time to push. And I find that helpful. Sometimes there's one group might be saying, no, we just need to breathe right now. And some people say, no, we got to push. Let's do this right now. The prophetic and pastoral stability and change, kind of some of the things that Wendy was talking about. And another image that comes to mind is the brake pedal and the gas pedal. And I'd say there's a fair amount of program meetings who you feel like you're just jerking, moving forward in these jerks of like the pastor hitting the gas pedal, let's go, and the elder saying, hold up a second. Well, what about this and what about this person, and we're going to offend that person, and so those are ongoing tensions. But what I really felt clear to emphasize tonight was asking this question: are there ways to make these tensions creative? Instead of just trying to eliminate them, is there a way to the iron sharpens iron is from the book of Proverbs. And I kept thinking about a pastor named Andy Stanley, who pastors a church in Atlanta. And he said once at a conference something that I have returned to a lot, and that is, when you face a challenge in your church or organization, you have to decide whether that challenge is a problem to be solved or a tension to be managed. And I changed that slightly to say tension to be held. But some things are problems to be solved, and some things are tensions that can be managed or leveraged to promote growth. So I'm trying to think of if I had some examples here. Well, for example, I was telling Wendy about this. It's a kind of a silly example, but maybe it's something you can relate to, in that my wife and I co-pastor a meeting here in East Tennessee, and we Ashlyn, my wife, had volunteered to do the Christmas play with the kids, a Christmas pageant. And so she wrote up this, it's a really great like little play, and the kids have lines, and there's some songs and candle lights at the end, a lovely thing. And so then somebody from ministry and council came up and said, oh, that sounds great. So when does Santa Claus come up? And we're like, Santa Claus, okay. That wasn't really part of the plan. I mean, usually, a lot of churches are like, keep the Christ and Christmas and reason for the season and all that. So no, we've got to have Santa at the end. Not separately, but it has to be at the end of the service. Santa comes out, and the kids come and tell them what they want. And so also with that, there's a tradition called the poke bag, which is like several different little fruits and stuff you put in this bag, and everybody gets one. And it goes back to the Civil War, when here in Tennessee, the meeting actually served as a hospital, and there's several different times they've served their community in those times of unrest and violence. And so I think that we haven't had the play yet, so I can't really tell you that it turned out to be this wonderful collaboration. But my hope is that the tension that we have between us wanting to change things and try new things as pastors, and the elders saying tradition, like fit their own tradition, that can be a creative tension that we hold, and we can go back and forth, and hopefully the ministry can be improved as a result. Another concept that's related comes from adaptive leadership, and you may have heard of that, and it's Ronald Heifetz was kind of the guy that popularized this idea, and he makes a distinction that I find really helpful, and that there are technical problems and there are adaptive challenges. So technical problems are problems that we can solve using the existing knowledge and procedures and expertise that we have right now. They tend to be more simple, solvable problems, whereas adaptive challenges are more complex issues that require significant changes in our behavior, mindsets, or culture inside of our group. And there's no obvious solution. And so it's going to require some learning or some transformation. And often adaptive challenges have a lot more of a relational element to them. And there's a Unitarian pastor that gives the example of so a technical problem would be like, you come into, we'll make it Quaker and say, come to the meeting house, and you flip the switch to turn the lights on and nothing happens. So you call up, a trustee and say, hey, something's going on with the meeting house. And they say, oh, let's try to flip the switch on the breaker and the lights are on. We got it taken care of, problem solved. That'd be just a technical problem. But adaptive challenge would be, you come in, flip the switch, and the lights don't come on. You call the trustee, they come, they flip the switch on the breaker, and nothing happens there either. Come to find out, there's a ongoing dispute between members of the trustees and the secretary about who has access to the meetings account and writes the checks to pay for the lights. And the secretary has hidden the checkbook. And so there's not just about simple fix, get the lights back on. It's about, well, there's a relational and a systemic issue here that's going to require some real change and time and spiritual energy. Also, I would give the example from our meeting at Lost Creek Friends. So every Sunday we have a time of joys and concerns, and long before we came, there's been this whiteboard where people list their prayer requests. And when we came, it was filled up completely to the point where if you had anything new, you would have to write in the tiniest little letters in the corner. And we asked, like, why is this the case? And it turns out that there's a gentleman in our meeting who is absolutely against wiping that whiteboard clean. He claims that he believes he's alive because he had a stroke, and they put his name up there, and we're holding him in the light, praying for him, and he believes he survived because of that. And so he was not about to erase things from that whiteboard. And there were also names on there of people who were deceased. And he didn't say this, but it seemed that he felt like wiping them off the board was wiping them out of the memory. So we're like, okay, wow, there's a lot of, the technical problem would be there's not enough room. So let's clean off the whiteboard and make room again. But there was an adaptive problem that is tied up with all these issues of forgetting about deceased members of the church and not praying for the sick and all these different things. So we had to come up with this solution that we got a cork board to the side, and wrote down all the names that were on the whiteboard before and put them up in little strips of paper on the cork board so that we wouldn't forget them. They continued to be held in our hearts. And now we had room on the whiteboard for the new. This tradition and innovation, this old and these perennial tensions that required an adaptive solution. So then a third concept comes from the Gottmans, who were relationship psychologists. And they make this distinction between solvable versus perpetual problems.
Mm.
And they studied conflict. I think they did this famous thing where they were like, within 4 minutes, we can tell you whether this relationship is going to survive or not, or I don't know. But anyway, solvable problems are like, the living room's not getting clean. So how about let's set up a chore schedule and you vacuum on Tuesdays and I'll dust on Thursdays. There we go. Problem solved. But perpetual problems are differences in personality and values that are not going away. One person really likes staying home. One person really likes to travel. One person likes to spend. One person likes to save. One person needs lots of time alone. One person needs time together. And so there's no way of quickly solving these problems. There's only a way of avoiding gridlock. And so I see the same thing happening in between elders and pastors, or just within congregations, is that there are technical problems, but there's also adaptive challenges. There's solvable problems, there's perpetual problems. And so, but we have the invitation to try to develop our relational capacities, emotional maturity, spiritual groundedness, so that we can hold those tensions in a creative way.
So, some of you might have heard this lecture. Vanessa July gave a very popular, vastly popular lecture on radical transformation at Pendle Hill. And in that lecture, what a lot of us picked up on more so than anything was this concept of the imaginal cells of moths and butterflies. That when a moth or butterfly goes into the cocoon, it turns into goo. If you were ever a child and opened a cocoon, I did, you would see that, it's just full of slime. It doesn't look like any sort of creature at all in that state. It used to be a creature and now it's slime, and then it reforms into a different creature. Um, and these imaginal cells, they know how to rearrange themselves into this, glorious creature with wings. They move around inside of this goo. And so in the case of a butterfly or a moth, you see a creature that was once alive and still has all of its parts, but it chooses, or it is driven to dissolve those parts and reform into something wholly new out of the old parts. And so Vanessa was calling us to kind of emerge from our history, transcend our history, and transform into something new, like what Christy was talking about, where we are called to transform because we are Quakers. And our job as public ministers is to be helpers and facilitators of this change. And our role as elders is to support public ministers in supporting our communities through this change. But the embrace for transformation is incredibly deep. I keep coming back to like just having chicken or egg problems. Like, how do we support public ministry when we're just such a mess? Like, some of the structures are just not there. Like, we are in the goo right now. Like we have forgotten, how to be a body, like, in the last 100 years. Um, and, our body was imperfect and problematic to begin with, but we don't even remember what that was. Like, it's just a mess, honestly. Um, so, like, how do we find hope and direction inside of this imaginal cocoon that we are in right now, in a world that deeply needs the leadership and eldership of our communities? It needs us to
Mm.
come out of this cocoon and be a majestic butterfly for the rest of the world. How do we get there? While I am not an advocate of, self-care as a bubble bath and a candle, I actually sort of am. I love those things. If you ever get me a Christmas present, definitely get me some soap and a candle. I love that. Um, but in terms of making social change, which I think is necessary, that has its limits. And so I have tended throughout my life to kind of move away from like self-help and like self-growth. But then when I was looking at my relationship with Joan, I see how she came along and mothered me. That I was like a motherless child when she found me. And she didn't tell me what to do, but she was there for me and she loved me through it. And when I think about like what enabled her, what qualities, what virtues does Joan have that enabled her to do that, and other elders in my life, I came up with this list. That when I think of Joan, I think of someone who embraces disruption. Joan has a lot of conflict. I'm going to show her this video and she's going to be like, OMG, Wendy. But like, I've seen Joan and I've seen Johan and I've seen Adria and I've seen Lucy, all these people that I mentioned, embrace disruption to their lives and say, huh, like, is there some truth here? Like they were able to be that non-anxious presence to themselves and to others that Andy was talking about in his good elders. When I think of these people, they were unafraid to address power imbalances that came to their attention, even when they were on the right side of it. They're the ones that had the power. They have accepted criticism, um, and they have, gracefully reconsidered awkward things that they might have said. And this is something I aspire to. When corrected, like in our first session, Andy was very uncomfortable with sharing our dirty laundry, which is we had a conflict I was unaware of. I had said something incredibly awkward the first time we had met. And it really hurt him. And so much so that he wrote about it in Friends Journal. And I read this article in Friends Journal where I knew he was talking about me. And instead of just avoiding it, I went and I asked Andy, is this me? And he was like, yes, I think so. And we talked about it. We talked about that experience. And so we cared for each other. We loved each other through a conflict. And in that way, we eldered one another and came to a better understanding. And, this series where we are addressing things that affect both unprogrammed and programmed meetings and ministers in those meetings comes out of that greater understanding. And the third thing that I can think of, which is sort of obvious, is providing support. But like, is it obvious? Because like it doesn't happen. So, so often it doesn't happen. Um, and so, I always I always wish I were more clever than I am, and I could be like, this is how you provide support. But if I were to do that, I would be that kind of elder that we were criticizing at the beginning. The know-it-all, the drive-by elder, the elder that has all the answers. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to just throw my hands up either, but I want us to be together and sit with this question, like the question we sat with at the beginning. What would it feel like to have a friend in this wilderness? And if we can identify what it would feel like to have a friend in this wilderness, and we can remember if we have had good elders, what kind of lessons we can learn about the virtues that they embody, we can choose to embody those in relationship with other people and practice them. Next slide, please. So I want to end my portion of this presentation by saying how I could not be more serious about how important it is for us to be asking ourselves what it would mean for us to be good elders, because it is a chicken or egg problem. Like, if we don't have them and we are the ones engaged in ministry, how do we break this cycle? It's like the cycle of family violence, like someone has to choose to be the one that says, I'm going to go to therapy and I am going to, seek to control myself in very specific ways so that my children are not engaged in this same struggle. And so for us to break the cycle of bad eldership, I wonder what kind of support you each need and how you can find that support and be the imperfect elder you're going to be, just like you're going to be an imperfect survivor, and continue to grow in that cocoon so that the people that come after you can grow even more into even more beautiful butterflies and transform our meetings so our meetings can transform this world that we live in. Next slide, please.
I really appreciate Wendy naming names and sharing pictures of specific people that have been elders in her life. And it's really important to recognize that these are not just abstract comments or abstract ideas, but these are relational and spiritual relationships, dynamics between people. And I was thinking, actually, as you were just talking, Wendy, about Jesus sending out the disciples in twos, and something I talk about often at our meeting is the individualism of our culture is a broken way of life. We treat it like it's normal, but to try to do everything, it's like you're saying with the self-help, and that's kind of the normative expectation in our culture, but it's not the one we're designed to live. And so I think that's part of the importance of eldering, is to go out, two by two, or to have nurturing community and support and accountability. And I really appreciate, just give a shout out to Della. In a lot of ways, we are kind of elders to each other as co-directors of the Quaker Leadership Center, that we can do that work together. So going forward, just some things that I would think would be helpful for programs, meetings, and eldering. as Wendy and I were talking the other day, nurture your inner elder was something that came up. And I think just nurturing that even within ourselves, of that sense of listening and accompaniment with others, and also being willing to come under the care of an elder ourselves. But also, I think a summary theme of my kind of hopes or recommendations is creating a culture of eldership. That yes, program meetings have elders or they have ministry and council, but it's not necessarily something that is emphasized as a particular calling, or valued as highly as I think would be helpful. And so kind of having the cultures in our meetings where we recognize the role of elders in collaboration with pastors. And that would include, I've been to some meetings where they have like a rotation where the elders are a part of the service each week. Whether that's sharing a reflection or a prayer, or being on the facing bench, integrating them more into that weekly rhythm of worship. And then this is, speaking of Della, this is her thing, her holy soapbox is the, what Protestants we call the, priesthood of all believers, or the prophethood of all believers, that we're a community of ministers, and that mutual ministry. So nurturing that. So those are some of my ideas and reflections. I would love to, we've got about 15 minutes. I would love to hear what's rising for folks as you've listened and reflected. Any questions or comments, or Wendy, if you had any other guidance for this time.